Hello again. This week we're going to look at Snuff and other boxes, and we're going to look at mainly going to look at the construction. We're going to look at the hinges on these things, because snuff boxes have always been popular. They've always been collected for the longest period, and the styles get revived. So you get a lot of 19th century copies of 18th century boxes, and 20th century copies of 18th and 19th century boxes. And they often look very, very similar to the untrained eye. So how do you tell them apart? Apart from hallmarks, of course. And a lot of these boxes are unmarked. And you have to look at construction. You have to look at wear, and there are a few other factors we'll touch on. Now, the first box I'm going to show you actually isn't a snuff box. It's a little comfit or pastille box. And it's that, and it's the earliest box I'm going to show you as well. It's about 1670, 1680. It's English. And it's very simple construction, as many boxes of the 17th century were. Single flattened plate for the base, single flattened plate for the cover, a strip of metal that has been soldered to form the body, and then you have little drawn wire. These are quite elaborate for these boxes. You've got rope twist here and then moulded wire, but often just a simple piece of metal going round, or a little bit of moulding, or a little bit of applied wire if it's slightly better quality, which this one is. You can see by the cover, normally this size of box, this type of box, will have a single flower engraved on it with a little chevron border, where this has 6 flower heads issuing out of a vase. So this is the sort of Rolls-Royce example, and yet it has the simplest form of cover, a pull-off cover. You couldn't ask for anything simpler, but it belies the skill involved in making this, actually, because even after 350 years I can put this lid on, turn it upside down, it won't fall off. And it's basically a friction fit. So even though these pieces of metal look the same size, this is slightly tapered. And a silversmith will have done that. Very fine adjustments, think of, sort of precision engineering. He will just tap round and he will just bowed this section out ever so slightly. And we're talking fractions of a millimetre here between it working and not working, success and failure. So when you initially put the lid on, there's a bit of play. So initially this is bigger than this because of the way it's been hammered. It's just slightly shaped. And yet as you push it further on, it begins to catch. So this becomes the same size of this, and then it becomes marginally bigger, and that creates the friction and holds the cover in place. And that may be obvious to many of you, and you might think, well, why are you saying that? That's nonsense. If a box like this, which only has a single maker's, unidentified maker's mark on it, so it's not conclusive to date, it helps, but it's not conclusive to date, the fact of how this cover works can indicate its age. Now, if I take this lid off, you can see now that originally when this was made, it was all polished bright silver. But can you see a band here, more correctly, a defined line, where this cover has gone on and off, on and off, on and off, hundreds, thousands of times through 350 years of use. And every time it goes on and off, it creates delicate vertical scratches to the body in various different places, random places all the time. But because it's described by the depth of this, it eventually makes a definitive line. That is what you want to look for. Now, that's not going to tell you if a box is 300 or 200 years old. It's just going to tell you that a box is old. And you're now going to say, well, now you've said that, forgers are going to get a piece of emery paper and they're just going to go round it and fake that, Michael. You can't fake the fine vertical scratches. You must always have an eyeglass. Look at it and you can see the fine network. You may see some scratches going round where someone has twisted the lid on, but there won't be very many of them. The greater number will be up and down, and honestly, if you tried to do that with a piece of sand or emery paper or a file, you wouldn't do it. You would go over. If you start to see marks beyond where this is fitted, then you have to worry, but there are none on this. The other thing, and this is more important, is when you've got a broad flat lip like this, sometimes they're shaped and go in and you can't do it. Where it's broad and flat like this, you will also see this corresponding wear on the inside lip. But importantly, and I'll get it like this, can you see a very bright, sort of almost less than a millimetre band all the way round here? Remember, when this pushes on, when any box with a push-on cover pushes on, to begin with, this is slightly smaller than this. So even when this is pushed fully on, it won't scratch in the very corners, the very tip when it's on. So it will only abrade up to about here. So you will get that little bright ring, clean ring, showing you that it's genuine wear and it hasn't been done by somebody going over it with something abrasive to give that pattern. And honestly, if somebody could fake it, if they were utterly determined to, and committed weeks and weeks of their time to doing it meticulously, they could do it, but then it wouldn't be worthwhile. It would cost too much, it would take too long, and it would be pointless. So that is a very good indicator of the period of these pull-off covers. And you have to be aware that this is historically the most popular way of securing a lid to a base. It was popular, particularly popular in the 17th century for small boxes because it was cost effective, but it's been used throughout the world right up to modern day. And it's not difficult. If you wanted to fake a box that looked like this, it would not be the most difficult thing in the world, particularly if it didn't have these decorative borders and the engraving on the top was simpler. And yet these genuine examples, 17th century boxes, are very rare and are quite valuable. Not exceptionally valuable, but quite valuable. So you can see you have to be aware, in this case, of consistent wear and of construction. And of course, you also want to look at how the box is finished. This has gilding inside that's worn, and it's quite difficult to create the effect of worn gilding. Again, nothing is impossible for the hugely talented forger, but we're talking about 19th and early 20th century copies that look good. They do look good. Some of them look very good, but they just fail on construction. Now, at the same period that this was being made, with its pull-off cover or push-on cover, whichever you prefer, you do get boxes with hinges. You always get hinges. Now, hinges are diagnostic. Now, this is a little, again, a little sweetmeat boxes. Maybe it's a snuff box. I don't know. This is inset with a hard stone. A moment to talk about inset hard stones whilst we have this here. They break. They break a lot. They get cracked, and there is a temptation to replace them with pieces of hard stone latterly. Often, later hard stones are a bit too bright, a bit too clean, and a bit too thick. They're not as finely cut as this. This is quite shallow, and you can also see it's cambered, it's worn in properly. A lot of the modern replacements are done on machine, and whilst this is hand polished to a camber, the modern ones are using saws, diamond tip saws and files and grinders, and they are completely flat. And you don't get those completely flat stones on period boxes. They're always shaped, gently shaped, because they are polished and smoothed by hand. So be aware of that. and we'll touch on that later with some of the other boxes. Now, this would have opened originally as a squeeze action. That's quite typical of late 17th century boxes. You press the sides and it's supposed to spring open. Here is the fitting, and there would have been a steel spring there that connected with the lid and kept a constant tension on it to open. And then the clip, which you can see here, the hook on the cover, just fitted again. I mean, we're talking again precision engineering. We're talking fractions of millimeters here, and when you just pressed on the side of the box, it just bowed this section forward enough for that to spring open, and then it would be, rather miraculous and marvelous. The thing about this that I want to concentrate on, though, is the hinge. Hinges, as you can see there, are quite fine things. That's a very fine hinge. It's composed of a tube of metal that is cut, and then alternating sections of that tube are either soldered onto the cover or the base, and they form the knuckles. So if you take your hand like this and you do that, those are the knuckles of the hinge, and they're secured with a pin going down through them. In this case, this is quite a fine hinge. It's got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15 knuckles on it, and is beautifully made. And these boxes tended to be made by Huguenot craftsmen that came into England at the end of the 17th century, and it has a little French style maker's mark, but for a maker working in England at the time, and it has all this lovely engraving on it. Hinges will tell you quite a lot about the period of a box. You can see that this hinge is integral to the design of it, but it stands ever so slightly proud of the box. Latterly, in 19th century boxes, most 19th century boxes, and I don't have a snuff box to show you, but I'll show you a vinaigrette, that hinge is far less prominent. It's also thinner, and the knuckles are of wider sections. You'll notice that the knuckles on early boxes, do tend to be quite short sections, particularly in the 17th century. You can get earlier boxes and boxes of this period where they only have 3 knuckles and they're quite crude, and rather than being cut from a fine drawn tube, they're actually cast sections or simply thicker pieces of silver that have been drilled and put together. But that's not really about the period of the box, that's about the quality of its manufacture. But let's look at another 17th century box to show you a very typical, it's not very typical because it's much better, but a very typical style of hinge that comes in at the end of the 17th century and into the 18th century, which is called the stand-away hinge. And you get boxes, this is a wonderful box, you get boxes in set, and now these are unmarked because the silver is just the frame to hold 2 different materials together. Often it's tortoiseshell, decorated with wonderful silver piqué work like this, all finely inlaid. This is breathtaking, by the way. It can be sections of ivory, though, of course, if you see one of those ivory boxes now, it would be illegal to buy, and you'd need to have an exemption as an exceptional item to buy it. Often they're hard stones, agates, carnelian, serpentines, more exotic types of stone like pudding stone. When they are hard stone, and this is when I was going to get back to hard stones, and this applies for ivory, for tortoiseshell, for wood, for any material, the cover and the base are going to come from the same source. They are effectively going to be cut from the same piece of material. They will match. And you have to be careful because these things get damaged. The hard stone ones certainly break. The tortoiseshell ones crack like buggery. And people replace them. Now, when they replace tortoiseshell, this is a late 17th century early 18th century snuff box. This tortoiseshell, although I can't show you, but I can feel it between my fingers, is thick. It is thick tortoiseshell. 17th and 18th century snuff boxes, unless they're extremely fine ones mounted in gold by Parisian box makers, the tortoiseshell will be thick. As you go through the 19th century, towards the end of the 19th, early 20th century, you can get replicas of these boxes. The tortoiseshell is much thinner. It's much lighter. Notice how dense this material is. And also, can you see a couple of light spots showing through? A couple of light spots showing through. They match. They're from the same shell. They're cut in the same way. They have the same depth of colour and consistency of tone. You must look for that. Now, I've gone on a little bit, so I'll see you right here for part 2.